you know, that's what could potentially kill the longevity of the game, and people don't really care that much about that kind of thing. And it got me onto thinking that the recent map design for Battlefield 4 was actually an interesting thing there, because the Battlefield 4 map design is something that hadn't necessarily happened before. And the curious thing with that was that we got to play the game in a state where there was no graphics. It was just a set template of polygons. But here is the thing, it was no less fun for that fact. It was no less fun because there were no graphics present. It was still just the same game. And, you know, it kind of made me think, well, not that I hadn't already thought this previously, but it did make you kind of realise, hey, these things are not that important. So when something like the Battlefront game comes out, and they start showing all this footage, and it's really shiny, and like, you know, lots of things, and everyone's like, oh my god, it looks amazing, like, look at that explosion, and it's like, it's great, but people seem to have, and gamers are so guilty of this, so bad of this, gamers always have this thing where they forget instantly something that had happened previous. So, for example, let's go back to Siege of Shanghai. When Siege of Shanghai first came out with Battlefield 4, the first thing that would happen, everybody, oh my god, look at the building, it's amazing! And then, like, after a month, everyone's like, yeah, whatever, just building down. And this is the thing, and this is why I try to sort of look past the gloss. Because if you don't look past that, you don't really see what the game is. And so when I see a lot of people, other producers, people in the community, the marketing hype, all talking about, look at this, and oh my god, and the explosion and this, and look at how amazing it looks, that's all great. But if you just take it all off and then look at what you're left with, that's really what you should be looking at when you're thinking, is this game going to be any good? Is this game going to be a game that I'm going to continue to play past the 2-3 month mark? You know? And so there's loads of examples of this. Like when you look back at other games which graphically and even perhaps the whole sort of feel, dynamic to the game wasn't as super polished, but it doesn't matter because the concept is good and the mechanics are good and it plays really well. An awesome example, and that's why another reason why indie games often excel, because well, this is the thing, Trigger's like, LT's getting deep at 2:45 in the morning. Yeah, it's true, because I got home now and I just was reading through all my comments, and then I was like, do you know what, this is something that I can talk about, because it's something that I don't see other people talk about. And okay, good example, right? A good example was a game back on PS1. I've mentioned this before, actually. There was a thing back on PS1 called the Net Yaroze. Net Yaroze was like a black PlayStation, which you could buy, and if you knew what you were doing, you could essentially create your own games with it. It was like a coding sort of dev kit, right? So you could pick this up and you could make your own PS1 games. It was a bit difficult back then though, because there wasn't really any way to sort of distribute that. But you used to get like demo discs on the front of like PlayStation Magazine, and they did one where games that people had created with Net Yaroze could actually like send them in, and then they would get given out to, you know, when you picked up the magazine. So I actually have this still. And one of these games, people should know as well, like I don't like sports in general, really. I'm not like a big sports person. But there was a great game on there, and it was basically like, it was like a football game, like soccer. And what this game was essentially just a green pitch with like your white lines and your goals and all this thing, and they were basically just kicking around like this little square ball, and the players were just little rectangles with a little rectangle head, and when they ran, their little arms went like this. Hold on. Yeah, their arms sort of went up and down like that, and they just sort of, and their little legs as well were going like this, and they would just run up and down the pitch, and the sounds were really sort of like graphic-y, so they'd go like poof, 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 poof. And it sounds like, and when they would kick the ball, it would go bing, like it would fly miles. It sounds like the crappiest game in the world, but it was amazing. It was because none of the fact that it looked like crap didn't matter at all. It was super fun to play. And me and my brother like burned hours and hours on that. And like he made all the teams and stuff, and you could choose like their abilities, their strength, etc. And it was just a super fun game. And that is a good example of what I'm talking about. You know, that game was probably about as far away from Star Wars Battlefront as you could get. It was literally almost pixel art. It was just flat vector pixel. But it literally didn't matter, because it was just a super fun game. The mechanics were great. It was really competitive, and you really felt like, come on. You wanted to win, you know, kind of like how if you've ever played air hockey against someone and you get really aggressive and you like want to win real bad. It was kind of like that. And so the thing is, like, when I now look at games, I try really hard to like not be taken in by the awe of just the graphics, because unless it's a single player, it kind of doesn't matter. If it's a single player game, it's fine, because if it's a campaign or just a narrative, then as you're going through, it's fine to be awed, because you're usually only going to play that like 1 or 2 times. So that moment is important, because you sort of come into maybe an environment or a narrative event in a game, and then, you know, something happens, you maybe, I don't know, like you, oh, okay, so like Journey, in Journey, like you come over the first hill and it pans back to the big mountain and the music starts at the same time, it's like, and like you're like, oh my god, like Journey's actually a really good example of that, because it has lots of moments like that, where something epic happens. But if you play that through like 10 times, every time it's less epic, because you know exactly what's going to happen, and it loses its sort of, you know, awe. Well, similarly, when you look at like an FPS game, if it has really flashy shit going on, right, to begin with, that's awesome. It's like if, okay, it's like if you watch like one Steven Seagal film, right, you'll go like, oh man, look, he's kicking that. If you watch 7 or 8 Steven Seagal films, after like the 3rd one, you'll be like, whatever, oh look, he's killed another 10 guys. Like, it just loses its whole sort of shebang. Like, it just doesn't excite you anymore. And that's what a lot of these games are kind of like. So it needs to have something more than that, and that's what people should really be looking at. Like, take that away and look at what you're left with, the raw game. How does that raw game play out? How involving is it for you as a player? And that's the kind of thing with Battlefront that concerns me, because when you look at it, it's like when you looked at previous Battlefront games, which had more scope in terms of scale and things that are happening there, that's the thing. So, like, you know, Star Wars Battlefront that's coming up looks amazing. Like, they have done a fantastic job, make no mistake, of making it look like Star Wars. It looks great. But the problem with that is that it's awesome, but if you're a gamer and you're planning to play this on a daily basis, it can't just be graphically awesome. There has to also be strong mechanics to back it up, because if there are not, then what you end up with is something, well, I mean, I don't even know, there's okay, I'm not going to use that example. I was going to say Hardline, but it's not that is not a comparison. But what you are left with is not necessarily like a husk, but just not something that's going to keep you engaged. It's not going to keep your attention. It's not going to keep you coming back to that game. You need to have more. What could you do? One thing is try to not put so much emphasis into the graphics and put more emphasis into things like objective team play. And here's the thing, people seem to always assume that when I talk about like objective team play and trying to push people to focus on that it's somehow not fun, or that it's somehow like, okay, you know, you're not about fun in the game, it's all serious, it's got to be serious. It's not about it being serious at all. What it's about is about creating battles which make you feel engaged. It's about creating battles which make you feel excited and on edge. And there's nothing more exciting than a close fought battle. But you only get that if you encourage people to actually fight properly and play for the objectives. And what I mean by properly is not just sitting back waiting but actually going, hey, okay, they're there, so we need to like get past them and fight, and then suddenly the other guys are like, shit, they flanked us, we've got to compensate for that. You know, if you don't have those things happening, then all you have is two teams just going like, sort of just, and that's not fun. That's boring. And so it bothers me a lot when I talk about how we've lost a lot of stuff in the game, and people sort of think that it's like a literal thing of, well, oh, what would you add? Would you have bigger maps? Would you have more guns? All this stuff. No, none of that. It's all about just encouraging people, and this is why we should have the team play initiative with the Battlefield 4. But we don't, because it's been put on the back seat for maps and guns. Like, for crying out loud, like maps and guns. I'm like it. If the gameplay remains the same, having a new map or having a new gun means nothing. Like it's just completely meaningless, because you can put someone in this place or in this place or this place, but if they play the same, you get the same game. It doesn't matter that it's on a different map. And this is what, you know, we're talking about. And so it concerns me that with Battlefront, like the fact that the gameplay is quite simplistic, and the fact that they haven't really added scope in terms of, so one thing people wanted was sort of space to land battles and stuff, and when you actually looked at the cancelled project of Battlefront prior to the one that exists right now, they were actually planning to have that. So the idea that you're up in space having like space battles, but then you fly down and you're like seamlessly into ground battles as well, that's a massive amount of scope in terms of like what can actually be happening, engaging. So imagine there's some guys like you chase them up into space and you're like fighting, blah 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 blah, and then you know some guys we're taking fire at like B target, blah blah. They got to fly back down and then sort of engage, and it just creates more of an atmosphere rather than making you feel like you're boxed in and locked into a just like a battle right there. LB7 says adding a map in a game is like adding a case on Monopoly. Yeah, I mean, let me just scroll back through some of the comments right here. Nothing I want to read. Yeah, Xavier's true. I mean, it's obviously true that indie and crowdfunded games have more creativity and heart put into them because there is no second chance, which in my opinion makes them better. Yeah, there's an interesting thing as well, which there was a lot of comment about this with E3. This is something else which kind of ties directly into this, which is that you see a lot more sequels now. You see a lot more sequels than you maybe did before, than individual games coming out, especially from the largest producers. And the main reason for that, and this is something again that people, I think, it's really obvious, but I don't think people really get it. When you're making a game, it's obviously like a massive financial investment, and so making a standalone game like a one-off or making something new is actually quite a big risk, because people, you know, they don't know if that game's going to be a success or not, right? So it's a big roll of the dice as to whether or not that game is actually going to be any good, or whether it's going to be received well, or if it's going to sell well. But if you have an established franchise, okay, like Battlefield or Call of Duty or Halo or any other game, you know, it could be anything, Total War, or EA Sports games, right? All of those things, they have a pre-established audience, so they are a safe bet. And Battlefront falls into that category. It's a safe bet. People are going to buy the game, right? So rather than make like a brand new game, it's obviously a much safer bet to make something that it already has a pre-existing audience, because they know, hey, people are going to buy this game, doesn't matter how we make it. And this is the thing, is that like these kind of sequels will continue to be made until they become unprofitable, and at that point they'll say, okay guys, people aren't buying this anymore, let's move on and do something else, you know. And that's not necessarily like, you know, that's not a bad or a good thing, it's just the way it is. The thing is as well, like, does it even matter? I mean, here's the thing as well, there is no problem with Battlefront being a more casual sort of run-gun blasting game. There is nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Until I actually have seen the game and played the game, I can't really say for sure, like, okay, is it going to be not exciting to play after a few rounds? We don't know, because you have to really see. It depends on the map design, it depends on the game modes, it depends on the size. They've got a lot of different game modes listed. Are they all going to be great? I don't know. I have to try them. Right now, I only play like 2 or 3 of the whole of the game modes on Battlefield 4, because the rest I just don't think really work or enjoyable. Salutin, so would you say they took a big risk creating Star Citizen? That's an interesting question. I don't know. Not really, because Star Citizen's audience was also pre-existing from the games that came before there. So it was like, you know, Chris Roberts has like a following and an audience. So when he came out and said, right, we're going to make this game, there's a large people that enjoy space MMO style games who would come immediately on board there. So it kind of is a big risk, but at the same time you also have to remember that game is largely crowdfunded. So it's not like they actually had to like find investors and say, hey, please give us like $1 million. You know, they let the community fund the game. So in some ways there's no risk to them there. There's a risk in terms of reputation, I would say, and to an extent they do have a responsibility to deliver what they have said they're going to do. But it's not so much as a risk as maybe like a produced game by EA or something like that. And also, like, you only have to look at, for example, like Hardline to see the consequences there. I mean, you know, there's been job losses, which may or may not be a direct consequence of how well Hardline performed. I think personally it seems likely that that's the case, but you know, there's no official line really on what happened there, so you can't really say for sure. Star Citizen will be multiplayer, yeah, of course it will. But so yeah, coming back to Battlefront, and it's like the thing is, the original Battlefronts were quite straightforward, so it's not like they were going to make it like super complicated, but that's not really the point. The point is just, are people going to really fight hard? And by having a more simplistic game, it's going to be interesting to see if that's the case. It could actually be a good thing, because if a game is simpler, it means it's easier for people to understand. And this is something, so for example with like Armour, okay, in Armour, it's actually a lot for people to sort of get their head around there. So for example, recently I made some missions in Armour using Zeus, and I thought they were quite straightforward, okay, so it's just like clear the town, don't kill civilians. People couldn't get their head around this. There was a couple of guys just charged in and just started shooting whatever they saw, you see. And so it makes me kind of think like Star Wars Battlefront could actually not be bad for the sake of its simplicity. It could actually be better by being simplistic, by having less options, by having a softer learning curve in terms of that game. It could mean that it's more accessible. It means that people don't have to worry about so many different factors, and it means that it's more, it's more palatable, it's more engaging for those players. They can just get straight into the game and get straight into the fight, and they don't have to worry too much about other things going on there. So it could actually be a positive thing. But the point is, we just don't know, and my experience leans me towards it's going to be not a good thing. But it could be a good thing. So there's a bit of a question mark, but I think it's still an interesting thing to think about there. There's actually been any word on who's doing Battlefield 5. Can't work out who'll be doing it at the moment. Dice LA on Battlefield 4, Stockholm on Star Wars, and Visceral on Hardline. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, they've clearly not said, but there's like, it's a bit of a weird one, because they seem to have, like, DICE have gone from being one studio into DICE Stockholm, DICE LA. DICE LA's been kind of working on Battlefield 4, but like they've also been sort of doing Mirror's in Stockholm. They've also seemed to have been doing like Mirror's Edge and this, so they seem to have like multiple projects going on. And from what I can tell and what I have known from previous situations, they seem to sort of split their team between different projects and stuff. So I think it almost would be the case to say I don't think any one studio would produce it, but I don't know. This is like just my complete guesswork. I would imagine that there would be like a core team, and then other people would sort of source in to work on bits and pieces. So That's the thing. And the thing is, like, I would imagine as well that in a studio like DICE, there will be sort of core veteran people, guys like Gustav Halling and people like this, who have worked on a lot of Battlefield games. And so they will want to be involved, whether or not it's like their primary thing at the time. They would want to sort of get their hand in and say, like, yeah, let's contribute to this. So that would be another thing as well. But just to come back, I think, as I say, there are just many examples where graphics are clearly by far and away not the most important thing, and it's just really important to remember that. It doesn't necessarily mean, like I say, that Hardline or sorry, not Hardline, the Battlefront would be bad. I mean, there's nothing to say that it's not going to be a super fun game. Sometimes less is more. It could be awesome fun because of its simplicity. Okay, so for example, I mean, I should probably make a separate video about this, because today I think my video was kind of saying, like, because of its simplicity it's going to be a bad thing. But at the same time, you actually have to say, like, hey, when you think about it, the simplicity aspect could be a good thing, because it means that, like I say, it's easy for people to just pick up, get into the game, and maybe that will actually help people have harder battles than we have seen in other games. A good example of this would be like Battlefield 1943. In Battlefield 1943, you had 3 classes, and you just select a class and go. And that is all there is to it. And that means that there is no worrying about all of those other bits and pieces. It's literally, you get your class and you fight and you play the game. And so that simplicity actually added to the combat a lot of the time. It made it sort of easier to get to grips with. It meant that people could sort of just focus more on what they were doing rather than worrying about what their setup was, or worrying like, oh, this guy's got this bloody attachment or whatever, so he's countered me in this way. It's already set. So I actually kind of welcome the simplicity there. Yeah, guys are talking about like what the next Battlefield will be. Let's go back to World War II or Vietnam. The trouble with World War II games, as a lot of people have said many times, is the limitations of the weapons, and also they're quite tired in terms of, you know, game production. The World War II stuff has been done so many times. I think the thing is that, like, some people who have maybe not played FPS for a very long time, because there are plenty of people who have literally started playing FPS with Battlefield 4, and anybody that's been around and played for a long time will know that World War II has been done to death. It's like so many times, and there are not that many weapons in World War II for gaming. You know, there's a limited selection of period guns which are appropriate for the time, and so if you have used that stuff, if you know, like MG42, Thompson, Browning, you know, the Springfield rifles, you know, it's all this kind of stuff. It's all the same, but there could be ways around this, and I've thought about this. I was thinking, like, you know, you could have stuff like resistance factions who like customize their weapons and stuff. You could have things like that. You could have like a specialized unit which has the ability to like customize its things and all this kind of stuff. The other option would be to go not future, but just like a couple, kind of like armor. You know how like armor has gone not into the future, but just like a few years, like 10 years ahead. Okay, you could do something like that, and then that way you have the same stuff you do now, but it just is slightly different in terms of its customization, different elements like that. You could create fiction and narrative around that, so that kind of would make it sort of more interesting. So there's things that you could do there like that as well. But I think, like I say, it all comes back to just how the game plays and how the community plays. And this has been very clearly demonstrated on my server this week. You know, on my server this week, we had a full server of people who are fighting and playing really hard for the objectives. And we had excellent games. We had really strong games because we had a group of people who were fighting hard and working really well on the map. Everyone sort of pushing, and not everyone was on the comms as well. Not everyone was on the comms, but they didn't need to be, because they could see what was happening, and they're like, okay, I'm going to react to this situation, I'm going to go over here, I'm going to go over there, you know, and it worked really well. And when we got to the end of the evening, multiple people said, like, hey, you know, there's clearly nothing wrong with the game, it's just the community that's fucked. And it's like, yeah, that's the situation. You know, it's the players that ruin the game, not the game itself. Because if people are sitting back, they're not getting involved, they're not pushing, they're not taking the fight forward, what you end up with is, like I've said, you know, you just end up with two people that are just kind of not really doing anything. Anyway, we should probably play some games now, but yeah, that was just really my thoughts about that, and I think it's interesting to sort of see the positive simplicity. I should probably note this down, because with how I'm feeling tonight, I'm probably going to forget this by tomorrow. What does this say? Codes for how much